What happens when a man with nothing challenges an empire built on everything? Not with swords or speeches, not with armies or ideology, but with silence, with hunger, with a life stripped bare of possessions, expectations, and fear. In the noisy splendor of classical Athens, a city blooming with marble temples, brilliant orators, and military pride, there walked a man who lived in a broken barrel, begged for scraps, and carried a lantern in broad daylight searching, he claimed, for an honest person. His name was Diogenes, and he wasn't mad. He was a philosopher, but not the kind who sat in ivory towers or argued in polished forums. No, Diogenes and the few who followed him were part of something far stranger, far bolder. A philosophical movement so raw, so unapologetically human, that it looked less like philosophy and more like protest. They were the Cynics. Born not in quiet contemplation but in open confrontation, Cynicism emerged as a rebellion against everything Athens held sacred: wealth, honor, conquest, conformity. Where society celebrated grandeur, they embraced obscurity. Where the empire demanded obedience, they practiced defiance. Their lives weren't performances for applause. They were protests made of flesh. Diogenes wasn't alone. There was Crates, who gave up a vast inheritance to live in poverty, and Hipparchia, a woman who walked away from privilege and propriety to live as an equal beside him. These weren't simply acts of eccentricity. They were radical declarations, living proofs that virtue did not reside in luxury, and truth did not wear the robes of power. Cynicism asked the most unsettling question of all: what if everything we call civilization is just an elaborate lie? And in asking that, they held up a mirror to empire and dared it to look. To understand the Cynics, we first have to understand the world they were rebelling against. Classical Athens, often romanticized as the cradle of democracy, reason, and artistic brilliance, was not the pure utopia we sometimes imagine. Beneath its gleaming marble and rhetorical flair lay a city gripped by contradiction. It was a democracy, yes, but only for a select few. Citizens had the right to vote, but only if they were free-born, male, and Athenian. Women, slaves, foreigners, they remained silent in the so-called City of Voices. Athens had grown powerful, wealthy, and proud, especially after its victory in the Persian Wars. But with pride came expansion, and with expansion, empire. What began as a defensive alliance, the Delian League, soon turned into a system of tribute and control. City-states that resisted Athenian dominance found themselves punished, their freedoms stripped, their wealth siphoned away. And then came the Peloponnesian War, a long, brutal conflict with Sparta that drained the Athenian spirit and filled its streets with disillusionment. The war exposed not just strategic failures, but moral ones. The empire Athens built in the name of liberty had become indistinguishable from the tyranny it once opposed. Amid this backdrop, the philosophical elite carried on their dialogues. Socrates questioned, Plato dreamed, Aristotle systematized. But even these thinkers, revolutionary in their own ways, often remained tethered to the structure of the city. The sophists, in particular, catered to the ambitions of the elite, teaching rhetoric not to seek truth, but to win debates, to gain influence. Truth became a tool, bendable, saleable, performative. And then came the Cynics, not from the academy, not from the palaces of thought, but from the gutters, from the margins. They weren't interested in being right, they were interested in being real. In a city obsessed with appearances, they stripped away everything until nothing false remained. Their poverty wasn't shameful, it was sacred. A way of saying, we will not play this game, we will not serve these illusions. Where the philosophers of the court refined ideas, the Cynics hurled them into the streets like thunderbolts. Their message was not comfortable, it was confrontational. They spoke not to impress, but to awaken. Because in an empire built on beautiful lies, the ugliest truth could still set you free. They say he was born in Sinope, a city by the Black Sea, the son of a banker. A man of means, at least at the start. But something happened. Maybe it was scandal. Maybe it was principle. Either way, Diogenes found himself exiled, cast out, stripped of home, status, and inheritance. Most would have withered under that weight. But not Diogenes. He took exile and turned it into freedom. He walked to Athens, dust-covered, possessionless, and declared war. Not with weapons, but with a life no one could ignore. He owned almost nothing. A cloak, a bag, a wooden bowl, until he saw a child drinking from his hands and realized even that was unnecessary. He made his home in a large ceramic jar, often called a barrel, in the marketplace. Right in the middle of public life, but completely outside its values. And there, he began his work. Diogenes wasn't insane. Though his actions often seemed shocking, even vulgar, they were razor-sharp critiques of a society built on pretense. He defecated, urinated, and pleasured himself in public, not to offend, but to expose. To remind Athenians that they too were animals pretending to be gods. That shame was learned. That morality had become performance. He called himself a dog, kynikos in Greek, from which we get the word cynic. But this wasn't an insult, it was a philosophy. The dog, he said, is honest. It eats when it's hungry, it barks at deceit, it doesn't hoard, it doesn't flatter. It lives by nature, not by law. And Diogenes lived like that dog, fearless, blunt, incorruptible. He mocked Plato, calling his grand theory of forms nonsense. When Plato defined a human as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, declaring, "Behold, Plato's human." He wasn't just ridiculing ideas. He was ridiculing abstraction itself, the way philosophy, when divorced from life, loses its soul. His most legendary moment came with Alexander the Great. The conqueror of worlds approached the beggar in the sun and offered him anything he desired. Diogenes didn't bow, he didn't praise. He simply said, "Stand out of my sunlight." That wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. A man who needs nothing is more powerful than a man who owns everything. Diogenes rejected institutions not out of naivety, but because he saw them as traps. The state, a machine of violence. Marriage, a contract of control. Property, a lie of ownership. Religion, too often a theater of fear. To participate in these systems, he believed, was to reinforce their illusions. So he withdrew, not into silence, but into scandal. His life became his protest, his body, his actions, his every breath a mirror held up to a world drunk on its own delusions. Diogenes didn't lead marches. He didn't write manifestos. But he was perhaps one of history's first true practitioners of civil disobedience. Not with slogans, but with stillness. Not with followers, but with unwavering presence. And that presence rippled outward. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do in a broken world is to live freely in it. If Diogenes was the solitary spark, Crates and Hipparchia were the slow-burning fire. Crates of Thebes was born into wealth, the kind of wealth that opens every door, that builds comfortable walls between you and the world's rawness. But Crates did something that still unsettles us, centuries later. He gave it all away. Every coin, every privilege. Not because he lost it, but because he chose to let it go. He wandered to Athens, already shaped by the ideas of Diogenes, and there, embraced the Cynic life. He slept on the streets. He dressed in rags. He taught by example, not from a podium. And then something even more remarkable happened. He met Hipparchia. She was not a street dweller. She came from a noble family, educated, wealthy, expected to marry well. But Hipparchia didn't want the life she was handed. She saw in Crates not disgrace, but clarity. She saw a man not owned by the world's expectations, and she fell in love. not just with him, but with the life he lived. When her parents tried to stop her, she refused. When they reminded her of the shame, the poverty, the scandal, she didn't flinch. She chose Crates, and not from behind a veil of romantic idealism, but with eyes wide open. She left behind silk for coarse wool, marble halls for the open air, luxury for truth. Their marriage was unlike anything Athens had seen. There was no dowry, no house, no hierarchy. They lived publicly, slept in porticos, taught in alleys. They made love without hiding, not to provoke, but to expose the absurdity of a world that shamed nature and worshipped false modesty. Together, they formed something rare, a partnership of equals. In a society where women were barely more than possessions, Hipparchia spoke, debated, walked beside her husband, not behind him. She was not his shadow. She was his mirror, his companion, his fellow rebel. Their union wasn't an escape from society. It was a direct challenge to it, a rejection of property, patriarchy, and pretense, a declaration that love, when stripped of control, can become a form of resistance. That family, reimagined, can be a site of liberation rather than subjugation. Crates and Hipparchia didn't just speak philosophy, they lived it. Their life together became a living argument. That wisdom doesn't come from lineage or letters, but from how fiercely one lives in alignment with their values. And that sometimes, the most revolutionary thing two people can do is to love without permission. Cynicism was never a school in the traditional sense. There were no lectures, no scrolls of doctrine, no temple of thought where students gathered to memorize maxims. If anything, it was an anti-school, a rebellion against philosophy that stayed trapped in words while the world burned in pretense. For the Cynics, philosophy wasn't something you discussed. It was something you did. Or more precisely, something you became. At the core of their practice was ascesis, a word that means training, discipline, even spiritual exercise, but not the kind that builds muscle or sharpens debate skills. This was soul work, a stripping away of illusion through hardship, a reshaping of the self through simplicity, discomfort, and endurance. The Cynics deliberately rejected comfort, not to punish themselves, but to stay free. They slept outdoors not because they had to, but because they chose not to depend on walls they didn't believe in. They ate scraps, raw vegetables, whatever they could find, because hunger, they said, was a better teacher than abundance. They walked barefoot in the heat and the cold, not to prove a point, but to remember that the body is stronger than luxury makes us believe. And their most powerful weapon? Shame, but not the kind society uses to control. The Cynics turned it outward. They made society feel ashamed of its own absurdities. By doing in public what others did in secret, they revealed how fragile our norms really are. They mocked the idea that decency was tied to wealth or titles. They made the elite uncomfortable, because discomfort, they believed, could awaken truth. In a city swelling with imperial pride, they mimicked beggars, intentionally so. They blurred the line between philosopher and vagrant to ask a haunting question. If the poor can live simply and honestly, why can't you? And yet, over time, something curious happened. A softer echo of cynicism began to take root. Stoicism. The Stoics, inspired by Cynic principles, preserved the call to virtue and inner resilience. But they brought it indoors. They made it palatable for senators and scholars. The Stoics taught endurance, but from within the system. The Cynics? They taught freedom by walking away from it entirely. That's what made cynicism so dangerous and so rare. It couldn't be bought, published, or preserved. It had to be lived. Every day, every breath, every barefooted step through a world it refused to bow to. It's one of the most famous encounters in all of ancient history. Alexander the Great, fresh from conquest, draped in imperial glory, stood before a ragged old man sunbathing in the dust. That man was Diogenes, and the conqueror, in a rare moment of humility, offered him anything he desired. Diogenes looked up, squinted, and said, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." The audacity of it, but also the clarity. In that one sentence, Diogenes flipped the world upside down, because in that moment, it wasn't Alexander who held the power. It was the man who needed nothing. That's the essence of the Cynic challenge. They didn't envy the rich or powerful. They pitied them. They didn't look up at palaces. They laughed at them. Because the empire, to the Cynics, wasn't impressive. It was hollow. A glittering illusion propped up by rituals, rules, and roles no one dared question. Until they did. The Cynics mocked laws not because they hated order, but because so much of what passed as justice was just privilege in disguise. They exposed rituals as empty theater, masks worn by those who feared being truly seen. They didn't just reject the state, they ridiculed its most sacred performances. The pomp, the titles, the ceremonies. All of it, to them, was a distraction from the real work of being human. But their rebellion wasn't just political, it was spiritual. The Cynics saw themselves not as Athenians or Spartans or even Greeks, but as cosmopolitans, citizens of the world, bound not by border or birthright, but by a deeper allegiance to nature, to reason, to honesty. In a time when identity was fused with empire, this was a radical act. A declaration that no ruler, no flag, no city could claim their soul. Their freedom came from self-sufficiency, from needing nothing they couldn't carry in their hands or store in their heart. And in a world built on dependency, on taxes, armies, obedience, that kind of freedom was revolutionary. Their laughter, their insults, their refusal to participate in the great game of status. These weren't acts of cruelty. They were arrows, sharp, precise, aimed at the swollen egos of those who mistook fear for respect. The Cynics didn't fight the empire with swords. They fought it with simplicity, with sunlight, with the unwavering truth that no throne is taller than the man who needs no throne at all. As time passed, the loud defiance of the Cynics began to quiet. Their presence faded from the streets of Athens, replaced not by direct challengers, but by a more measured voice. Stoicism. Stoicism borrowed much from the Cynics. The call to virtue, the practice of endurance, the suspicion of wealth and fame. But it offered those ideas in a more polished form, suitable for senators, generals, and emperors. It taught how to live with detachment, but without throwing stones at the palace walls. Where the Cynics renounced society, the Stoics sought to operate wisely within it. Still, the Cynic spirit lingered. In Roman times, the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, himself once a slave, spoke with deep admiration for the Cynics. He saw in them a kind of holy madness, a purity of intention that most could not match. To him, the true Cynic was a kind of spiritual warrior, fearless, unflinching, bound only to truth. And in other corners of the world, their legacy kept flickering. Early Christians, especially the Desert Fathers, lived in caves and practiced radical poverty. Their prayers replaced the Cynic's mockery, but the rhythm was familiar. Reject comfort, resist corruption, return to the essence. Over time, though, the edge dulled. What began as protest became performance. The Cynic lifestyle was absorbed into traditions of asceticism. Admirable, yes, but less subversive, less dangerous. It became a spiritual exercise rather than a social critique. Yet the echoes never fully died. You can still hear them today in the voices of anarchists, mystics, street artists, monks, whistleblowers. Anyone who chooses to live outside the script, to reject the rewards of obedience, to walk barefoot through a world that demands shoes of gold. The Cynics may have vanished from the cities, but their questions still live. And sometimes, in the silence after the noise, their laughter still lingers. What would Diogenes say if he woke up in our world, to a planet wrapped in satellites and screens, to cities humming with wealth while millions sleep without shelter, to a civilization that prizes convenience, efficiency, and productivity, often at the expense of presence, meaning, and truth? What would he say to a world ruled not by kings and soldiers, but by algorithms, corporations, and quietly invisible empires? He might laugh, or cry, or simply pick up his lantern and keep walking, still searching for someone honest. And yet, his spirit isn't entirely lost. We still see fragments of that old defiance, among whistleblowers who risk everything to reveal the truth, among street artists who use walls as protest, among those who leave behind the noise to live off the grid, quietly rejecting the values they were told to chase. These are the modern cynics, not always perfect, not always recognized, but still burning with that old hunger for a life aligned with what's real. Today, the word cynicism has been corrupted. It no longer means radical honesty. It means resignation, sarcasm, the shrug of someone who's given up. But ancient cynicism wasn't about giving up. It was about giving everything away so that truth could finally breathe. And maybe that's the invitation still echoing beneath the noise of our time. Not to move to a barrel or renounce the world entirely, but to ask, what illusions have we mistaken for necessity? What comforts have we confused with goodness? What parts of ourselves have we sold quietly for approval, for safety, for fitting in? The cynic spirit doesn't live in the past. It lives in anyone who dares to ask, is this real? Is this mine? Is this worth the price? Diogenes called himself a dog, and not as an insult, but as a badge of honor. To him, the dog was everything society feared and yet secretly admired. Untamed, loyal not to kings or creeds, but to instinct, to hunger, to truth, to the raw, unfiltered experience of being alive. A creature that begs for nothing and bites only when provoked. And maybe that's the deepest message the Cynics ever gave us, that freedom isn't granted by law or title. It's found in the refusal to play a game that was rigged from the start. It's born not in obedience, but in the courage to live without lies. They didn't build kingdoms. They didn't write manifestos. They walked barefoot through the world with nothing to sell, nothing to prove, and nothing to fear. And in doing so, they left behind something far more lasting than monuments. A challenge. To see through the illusions. To strip away the polish, to dare, even for a moment, to be real. So in a world built on image and empire, here's the question they still ask us. Will you live like a statue? Or will you live like a dog,